We're good to go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Geotalks. Today's speaker is Chris Harris, who is not an isotope geochemist from UCT. That's another guy. Today's Chris Harris is just finished his PhD a couple of months ago. Yeah. With very, very good examiner reviews. Many examiners, or two of the examiners described it as one of the top theses that they've read. And so Chris has finished his PhD here at Wits. He also did his MSc here, although that was at the ESI, working on plant fossils in the Wittenberg group. And before that, he did his undergrad at Rhodes University. And so his PhD has been on sedimentology, stratigraphy, and fossils and ichnology in the Wittenberg Formation. And that's what you'll tell us about today. Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Zubair. And thanks to the school for having me. Yeah, it's really nice of you all to come out and be with me today. This is a big moment for me. This all started back in 2015, 10 years ago. There I was standing out on an outcrop in the Eastern Cape. I was employed as a paleontological heritage monitor on the roadworks that Sanrail was busy working on. They were upgrading the N2 highway and they went through some fossil sites. So one day Rob Guest called me up and he said, "Hi, Chris, would you like a job?" And so at first I said no, but well, I was trying to make it as a musician, but that didn't really work out. So I took the job. And so there I was standing looking slightly displeased because these marks over here are traces, but not trace fossils. They are the marks of an excavator machine raking our nice fossil layer. So there I made a little sign to tell the excavator machine to stay away. And eventually I think the steel rods that I used to pin up the sign popped one of their tires. So too bad. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the results of my PhD. But to begin with, yeah, there I was on the outcrop and it was total chaos. This site is called Coombs Hill. And yeah, so they were expanding the road. There was just scree and dust everywhere. And then as soon as the rain came down, it would wash everything away and suddenly we could see stuff. We could see geology. So what Rob and I started to notice was that some of these cross beds were upside down. As you can see, that is truncated on the bottom. Likewise here and over here as well. So that isn't, those are overturned beds. And we started to wonder if we knew up from down at all. Then eventually one day the eureka moment happened. We found a fold axis running right through the middle of the quarry. I'm not sure if you can actually see this from the photo, but there's a very tight synclinal fold with hardly any change in dip. And so I realized I needed to go back and study to understand the rocks that I was watching being destroyed. So I came to Wits. For my honors project, I studied with Cameron Penn Clark and Bruce Rubidge and Rob Guest. And I went back to the site, logged the geology, eventually published it in the South African Journal of Science. So the Cape Fold Belt, it formed as part of a regional orogenic event. During deposition of the Cape supergroup, we had a passive margin tectonic setting, very stable tectonic setting, and then something happened and there was a subduction zone that developed and caused orogenic belts right across the southern margin of Gondwana. So now the Witpoort Formation. This is basically the sum of stratigraphic logging work that has been done on the Witpoort Formation before I got started. So here on the left, we have Tam and Johnson from the Geology of South Africa textbook. They logged a beautiful section at Witpoort where you can see the whole of the formation. Here, the underlying strata of the Walterfreder Formation were interpreted as an offshore or pro-delta setting. The lower member of the Witpoort, which is a very red weathering member, the Roy Runt member, was interpreted as a shore-face deposit. And the upper, very white weathering and clean, mature tabular sandstones of the Paderpoort member were interpreted as the beach And then we have a flooding surface overlying of the Kweekvlei Formation, again interpreted as offshore deposits. So here we have a 350-meter thick shore face to beach deposit. Hiller and Taylor in 1992 produced some of the best sedimentary facies analysis that I had available. Their work was, they worked on a fossil site that was discovered in 1985 that was then known as the bypass cutting. They produced some beautiful stratigraphic logs and interpreted these strata here, which is now known as Waterloo Farm. They interpreted them as tidal inlet channels, washover sands, and ebb and flood tidal deltas, as well as these black lagoonal muds. And this was a huge breakthrough in the Witpoort Formation because for the first time, based on fossils, it had been realized that shale in the Witpoort Formation was developed in the back shore or in a lagoonal setting in brackish water, not offshore. But as you can see, the Witpoort Formation is undifferentiated. It has no members in it. And they placed this site with fish and plant fossils here in sort of low middle Witpoort Formation. Later, Rob Guess did his PhD on the paleontology of Waterloo Farm, and he reinterpreted the site as occurring somewhere up near the top of the Witpoort Formation. So these studies give me my first hypothesis. The Witpoort Formation was deposited in an open marine and barrier island shoreline setting. In 1986, Cooper came along and correlated the global sea level curve for the Devonian to the Cape Supergroup. This global sea level curve was based on a review of many different basins, including Belgium, China, North America mostly. And what Cooper noticed is that the strata of the Cape Supergroup seemed to mimic that curve, with the Witpoort Formation representing a regression or a sea level fall towards the end of the Devonian period. Now, this work has been partially revised by Cameron Penn Clark in the Bokkefold group, but this area here still remains a mystery as to whether sea level change is actually the main control of the Witpoort. And so that is my second hypothesis, that used to sea or global sea level was a dominant control. Okay, let me speak for a minute about the late Devonian. So this epoch can be considered as the birth of the modern world. For example, in the late Devonian, we get the first globally spread forests on Earth. New research has found older forests dating to the late Middle Devonian in New York State. But for the first time on Earth, we have evidence that trees had spread worldwide. This is coincident with what has been estimated as a 40-fold decrease in atmospheric CO2 levels from the Devonian into the Carboniferous, where in the Carboniferous we had around about present-day CO2 levels, as well as a major global cooling event. There was also a series of episodes where the ocean turned totally anoxic, and so the late Devonian turned out to be quite a disruptive interval. At the same time as the ocean turned anoxic, fish started to breathe air and develop limbs and wanted to come out on land. So it's a nice story, and it might be overly simplistic, but we can say that trees gave vertebrates the impetus to come out onto land, as well as a nice shady place to chill. So on the right here, this is a paper that was published by Rob Guess and Per Alberg, 2018. And they described the first known tetrapods from South Africa, as well as the only tetrapods that we have from the high latitude polar regions of Gondwana. So here the South Pole is positioned in sort of Central Africa, and South Africa is situated within what is projected as the late Devonian Antarctic Circle. All right, so the Witpoort Formation pretty much has a monopoly on polar Devonian tetrapods. The only other ones we know in Gondwana are in Australia in the sort of paleo subtropics. And we also have the oldest evidence for trees in this region. Okay, so we've got some fossil localities here. These two sites were discovered during the roadworks I told you about, and then there are some older sites, Waterloo Farm, which I mentioned, as well as Huisenspoort. And in cross-section, we can see that the Witpoort Formation, which is quite a hard sandstone-rich deposit, forms these prominent ridges, and these sites occur on opposite sides of the Grahamstown synclinorium. So one of my aims in my PhD was to be able to correlate these localities. Unfortunately, deformation in the Cape Fold Belt gets worse to the east. So in this area, there's no complete section of the Witpoort Formation. So let's just briefly talk about the fossil localities. Howison's Poort, it's a historical locality that I think it was cut in the 1850s by Andrew Geddes Bain. And they found plant fossils, which were later described by Edna Plumstead in her review of the Devonian flora of South Africa. And based on these little bits, she described some new species, one of which was Deutoitia merasia. Now, Deutoitia is a genus of tiny little Cooksonia-like things that are known from the Table Mountain group. And it was later shown that Plumstead's Deutoitia merasia is actually just the distal fructs of a much bigger plant, Guess and Prestiani, called Phlebelopterus lococanensis. Okay. Now, Rabbit Ridge. This is a site that is quite close to the base of the Witpoort Formation. It contains lingulid brachiopods, and it's the first time we found lingulids in the Witpoort Formation. Yeah, I collected more than 100 of these things and plotted them on a growth curve and found, okay, well, there was a very nice growth curve, and they're all one species. There was a shortage of young individuals, and the population formed a nice bell-shaped curve, which suggests fairly favorable conditions for them. Lingulids are very interesting animals. They're the only brachiopods that burrow, and they have a remarkable tolerance of moving from the ocean into freshwater influenced environments. So there's no brachiopod that has such supreme qualities of existing in lagoons and tidal flats. Furthermore, it's the youngest marine invertebrate that we know of in the Cape supergroup. We published this research in Peleos, and they were kind enough to put Maggie Newman's reconstruction of the site on their front cover. Then Coombs Hill. Yeah, eventually during the roadworks, we collected some spectacular plants, but the site remains a disappointment as we never found the fish. During my master's, I described some of these plant remains. And yeah, we've got some new species there, spectacular material, including a whole frond of the tree Archaeopteris. It's not really a frond, it's actually a lateral branch, but yeah. There's also seaweeds, beautiful fructs of Archaeopteris, bivalves, and 3 species of lycopods. So I wasn't able to anchor this locality stratigraphically in the Witpoort Formation column. And yeah, that still haunts me today. The structure is very, very complicated around that site. And then we have Waterloo Farm. It's got about 20, perhaps 1 or 2 more. There was just a paper that came out last week describing some new acanthodians. And yeah, the site is incredibly diverse. It's one of the most complete ecosystems, if not the most complete ecosystem that we know of from the Furmenian in the world at the time. It's also got eurypterids, which are these gigantic arthropods, bivalves, a dozen plant taxa, and all of these were thought by Rob Guess, based on paleontology, to have accumulated in an estuary. Oh yeah, there we go. Oh, did I break it? No, just kidding. Okay, so this is my study area. Yeah, we eventually had to restrict our study to the Eastern Cape. The Witpoort outcrops right along the northern perimeter of the Cape Fold Belt. But yeah, we focused on this area because of these nice fossil localities, whereas further west, we don't seem to have the right facies to preserve such amazing fossils. And we're still arguing about why that might be. Unfortunately, yeah, someone needs to go west. Okay, so as I said before, the Witpoort is projected at about 70 degrees south. And it occurs right here at the top of the Cape supergroup stratigraphic column. So I set out to log strata. All right, so this is Viport, the site that I mentioned from Tam and Johnson. You can see the whole of the Viport formation here, and that black arrow is the base of the formation. This is the red Rooirand member. There's the contact with the Paderpoort, and then the Paderpoort gets duplicated here a number of times, and you can see this beautiful open anticline. Further up in one of these folds, we get the top of the Witpoort formation, contact with the Kweekvlei, which is sharp everywhere across the basin. And yeah, this log is about just over 300 meters of strata. So Benele. Yeah, we were lucky enough to have Benele come to chill with us in the field. Yeah, jokes aside, Benele came to do petrography on that site. Yeah, he very ably collected samples and logged them to their facies as well as to the strat column. It's the first time that petrography and facies analysis have been united in the Witpoort formation, or I think even in the Witterberg. Yeah, and Benele then plotted his samples on these beautiful QFL diagrams, and he came out with quartz arenites and sub-arenites mostly. And as expected, he got a whole lot of quartz, mica, matrix, and some accessory minerals of zircon and hematite. All right, so I was very lucky to have Benele along so that I didn't have to get too bogged down staring down the microscope. I could do other things. Oh yeah, terminology. So when I describe a rock, I'm using the terminology of Campbell. It's not as widely applied of a terminology as I think it should be. Most people use the McKee and Weir scheme, which says that any stratum that's bigger than a centimeter is known as a bed, and anyone that's thinner than a centimeter is a lamina. The original historical use of the word bed is basically the principal layering of a rock. And so according to Campbell's terminology, these units that we see here are beds separated by muddy lamina, and they occur in a bed set that is thinning upwards. This terminology, I recommend it because it's also very intuitive. Beds are measured in centimeters and lamina are measured in millimeters, and there's basically the same intervals of descriptive increments. So when you're in the field, it's very intuitive to use. Highly recommend it. When rotating strata to understand paleocurrent directions, whether plunge is necessary or not, yeah, I ran a test because according to Potter and Pettyjohn, if plunge is less than 10 degrees, you don't need to compensate for it. I found that with the site that has the highest plunge of 8 degrees, the vector mean changed by 5 degrees when I compensated for plunge. So yeah, it's another introduction of error if you don't do it. Okay, great. Well, if you're not asleep yet, this is the Waterloo Farm section. It's the only one that I'm going to describe in detail, and of course, because it's the most exciting one. Waterloo Farm outcrops in the axis of an open anticline, and that's part of the reason why it's so nicely preserved, because it's horizontal and it's protected from water, so the water runs off on either limb. We can see outcrop of the top of the Witpoort formation at equal distances on either side of this open anticline. And the poles to the bedding planes plot very nicely along a great circle, so that's always a good sign. I logged a bunch of faults as well, but I won't say too much about them. Okay, so let's take a look. At the base of the section, we've got some very nice lenticular beds, beautiful cross stratification. We've got fossils and trace fossils down there, and yeah, the paleocurrent indicators are incredibly interesting. The overlying package is covered in shotcrete, unfortunately, because just at the top of this, here is the famous Waterloo Farm black shale, and it's covered now in shotcrete, so we can't even have a peck at it. Rob Guess, back in the 90s, collected beautiful specimens of the arborescent tree lycopod Leptophyllum, some with roots attached. That's incredibly rare. And then right up here near the top of the shotcrete, Rob also collected some beautiful trace fossils, and this is Cruziana, and he identified this back in his master's. I have actually, John Almond already suggested in a conference abstract that this was the isopod Ignis type, which has now been synonymized with Cruziana. It's Cruziana problematica, and it's probably not made by trilobites, as most people think. It's more of a non-marine trace, isopod Ignis, and it's probably made by an isopod. But yeah, Cruziana problematica. Okay, here's the shale. Now, this is the main shale level, but this is not the fish-bearing site. So there's a shale exposed, and it contains plants, and it has a very different flavor and signature. It has no coprolites in it. The plants are way more three-dimensional, and it seems to occur along strike with the main fish lens. But unfortunately, because of the shotcrete, I wasn't really able to understand what's going on between these two layers. But I did find a nice fault running right through the middle of this. So perhaps that has something to do with it. Overlying the shale, we've got some conglomerates where a down-cutting surface has ripped up clasts of the shale and tossed them down. And over here, beautiful rhythmic lamination with flazer and lenticular bidirectional ripples. And right up here at the top of the section is another beautiful shale bed. This one also contains plants and traces, no fish. So looking from this upper shale to the east, we can see over here, over there is the top of the Witpoort Formation. And just behind that, we can see this green belt, which is an outcrop of the Lake Mens subgroup, which overlies the Witpoort Formation. This cutting here is a very mature tabular quartz arenite section. And for the first time, I recognized that that in this part of the study area is the Witpoort member. There was also a massive thrust running right through the middle of this. So yeah, for you structural geologists, I think that might be the last bit that I say about structures. Okay, so putting all of these sections into a stratigraphic framework now. Here we've got Waterloo Farm underlying the Witpoort member, represented by the Grey Dam section. The Grey Dam section seems to be thicker than the Witpoort at Witpoort, but that might be related to the aforementioned thrust. And yeah, my argument is that the Roy-Runt member can be recognized based on sedimentary facies, because what we're getting is these rhythmic alternations of sandstone and heterolithics and mudstone at a scale of 10 to 20 meters that is similar right across the basin. Whereas in the Witpoort member, we're just getting plain old quartz arenite. At the top of the formation, here's the conglomeratic Schizarray Kloof member, and I correlated it with conglomerates at the top of the formation. So my argument is that all three of the members extend right across the basin. Now, I logged about 12 different facies, 12 or 13, and I'm not going to go through them each here, but the facies, based on their vertical and lateral relationships, as well as trace fossil and fossil content, are grouped into facies assemblages. The first one is very mature sheet-like sandstones. They're very highly amalgamated, medium bedded, and massive. Yeah, this facies assemblage has a lack of trace fossils and body fossils, and the paleocurrent vectors are basically quite unidirectional with a dominant mode to the southwest. I've interpreted these deposits as braided river systems. Over here, we see a very nice erosional surface that is mantled by these boulders of mudstone. And there's no evidence of mud beds along this line, so there's obviously some kind of unconformity there. Next, fluvio-estuarine channels. Now, these differ from the braided river systems in that they become a lot more lenticular, often thicker bedded. They contain mud drapes, reactivation surfaces, which are basically minor erosion surfaces without an interruption or a change in facies. And yeah, looking at the paleocurrent indicators, especially at this beautiful Waterloo Farm outcrop, in the lower part of the section over here, we see very unidirectional offshore directed cross strata, which changes to bimodal shore parallel strata. And then up at the top of the section, we get a reversal. And I'm interpreting that as a typical fluvio-estuarine sequence where we go from progradation to retrogradation. This facies assemblage also contains a lot of plants and sometimes trace fossils. Here's the heterolithic facies assemblage. This is where most of the trace fossils from the study area come. And we're starting to see some more reversals in the flow vectors here. This basically contains almost any sedimentary facies. It's very heterolithic, very variable, but the uniting feature is that it's alternation between sand and mud, and it often underlies prominent shale beds. Estuary basin muds. Now, based on the fossil contents, we can say that a lot of these muds accumulated in the estuary. We can't exclude that some of it is fluvial overbank mud, but for the most part, what we're seeing is trace fossils and body fossils that are consistent with the brackish water setting. Ripple interbeds in this facies assemblage tend to point in a landward direction. And here we see a beautiful example of some of the variations with rhythmic lamination here, very fine sand and mud, and then your flazer and lenticular ripples upwards to a carbonaceous black shale. So it's a very variable facies assemblage. This is a block of Coombs Hill mudstone over here. And you can see these alternating red and gray layers. Based on the fact that plants in this bed are very three-dimensional, and one plant can occupy maybe 1 or 2 centimeters of matrix, I'm interpreting these as potentially seasonal layers. Now, that kind of depositional rate would be consistent with the rates that we can find in estuaries and lagoons, where flocculation of clays tends to form really rapid accretion of mud. And then lastly, and only at Vierpoort, we're seeing types of lenticular sandstones that quite resemble the fluvio-estuarine channels, except their paleocurrent signal is in the reverse direction. And also, these beds have got more prominent mud drapes, as well as very regular rhythmic reactivation surfaces. And in the toe sets of the beds, we're sometimes getting flazer and lenticular rippling. So I'm interpreting those as tidal inlet channels. Now, we've got various lines of evidence that suggests that there were frozen landscapes in the Witpoort Formation. The first one at top left is some drop stones that have been collected by Rob from the Waterloo Farm Black Shale. This is a drop stone. It's made of fine sand. It's not associated with any coarser layer in the shale. And drop stones can arise by various mechanisms. They can be dropped by the guts of vertebrates. They can be carried by tree roots. But in this case, it seems likely, firstly, that this drop stone has been rounded. So it has been transported along its way. And then also it has these lateral pinch out margins. I'm suggesting that what happened was that it was transported in a frozen state, landed on the bottom where it melted, and where it was exposed at surface, it started to subside slightly. And we're seeing very similar things in some of these conglomerate layers with these eye-shaped sand clasts. Again, sand needs to have some kind of consolidating mechanism to be transported. So algal binding is an option. Cementation by carbonate is an option. But again, I think freezing by ice is the most plausible explanation. Then at 2 sites in the upper Royrand member, I found ice keel scour marks. They look like ripples, but they're not. If you stare at them long enough, they'll tell you. Yeah, those are meant to be ice that's floating along and dragging along the bottom and creating these very, very straight furrows in the rock. Yeah. And then lastly, we have extra formational conglomerates at the top of the Witpoort Formation that's in the Skitterij Kloof member. Now, there is no unequivocal evidence that these conglomerates are caused by glaciers. It could be that there was uplift in the source area, perhaps. But I think the most parsimonious explanation is that these conglomerates, which are the first extra clasts that we get since the Pakkeis Tillite from the Ordovician at the top of the Table Mountain group, that they are related to a glacial event. And I'll explain more about that later. Anyways, in the meantime, I do have a class that I collected from the Pakkeis. I wonder if you'd like to pass it around. It's got some very distinctive glacial features on it. So yeah, if I can just hand that to you. Yeah, facets and striations on a clast that's quite distinctive for deposition and transport by glaciers. All right, and then we have some evidence for tides. This includes rhythmic lamination and mud drapes, as well as double drapes. Now, there's no known origin for double mud drapes, except tides. With the rhythmites, I haven't found in any of them the number of lamina that you would expect to find in a fully developed tidal bundle. Of course, within a neap spring tidal cycle, you'd expect the current energy to fluctuate, and there should be, within one neap spring tidal cycle, there should be 24 tidal events if you're in a semi-diurnal tidal regime. But I found between 8 and 12 at most. So I'm suggesting that these rhythmites are incomplete tidal bundles, and that it's perhaps that the Witpoort developed in a micro-tidal setting, and that tides aren't nearly as strong and able to produce such thick and prominent rhythmites. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about trace fossils. This is my favorite subject. I could give a whole talk on them. But yeah, I've identified 20 ichnogenera in the Witpoort Formation, as well as 4 or 5 kinds that I wasn't able to identify. Prior to this, there were 2 that were identified by Rob Guess. But the Witpoort Formation is well known for being completely devoid of fossils. So that we've been working on these roadwork sites and collecting them. We've built up quite a collection at the Albany Museum, Rob Guess and myself. Okay, Altichnus is a upwards branching funnel-shaped burrow, possibly made by a budding worm. Archeonassa, a surface to shallow subsurface trail. There's Arenicolites curvatus, which is a very open U-shaped burrow. Cochlichnus, a very tightly meandering trace. Crisiana problematica, I spoke about this. Gordia marina is a winding looping trace that has that crosses over itself regularly. Lingulichnus verticalis is interpreted as the burrow of a lingulid brachiopod. It's typically an eye-shaped burrow that's got a thick lining. And here's a specimen of Lingulichnus next to a lingulid brachiopod. Lochia, the resting traces of bivalves, these almond-shaped things that you find on the base of beds. Neurites is a very interesting trace. It's a marine trace fossil, and it's known pretty much throughout the geological record. We still don't know exactly what made it. Neurites in the Paleozoic occurred in the intertidal zone, and in post-Paleozoic strata, it's restricted to deep marine environments. Paleophycus is a lined horizontal burrow. Phycodes is a palmate branching trace. Planolites, an unlined burrow. Samachnites, this is a trace that's very well represented in carboniferous intertidal deposits. Petitroplasma, which is lochia that occur in serial alignment. Petitroplasma is probably the result of periodic resting and locomotion by a bivalve. Rhizophycus, which is the resting traces associated with Cruziana problematica. Selenognites. This type of trace is thought to be distinctive of horseshoe crabs, which we have no fossil record of in the Cape supergroup. Scalichnus. This is a bottle-shaped trace, which is overlain by tubes. It's suggested that a bivalve is living in this structure, and that the overlying tube is the siphon trace of the bivalve, and sometimes we find them branching. The bedding plane expression of this trace is a pair of mantled tubes, which I'm interpreting as the inhalant and exhalant siphons of a bivalve. Undichna, those are the traces made by the fins of a fish as it swims along, drags its fins along the bottom. These are from Waterloo Farm, and the problem with studying them is that they're very big, with a wavelength of 30 to 50 centimeters. So it's hard to get slabs to understand the repetition. So I left them in sort of open species level taxonomy. This is the oldest vertebrate trace fossil from Gondwana. Zoophycus, another typically marine trace, and Spirophyton. I'm not convinced that these are separate ichnogenera, but I have spoken about that at a conference before. They're very similar traces, except that Spirophyton is just a lot smaller. And then plug-shaped burrows, small plug-shaped burrows, a compound trace, which I have some idea of what might have made this trace. Yeah, you guessed it, a bivalve. And bromelites, which are the collective name for coprolites and regurgitolites, which are fossilized digestive products. We've got several types of these, and there's the spiral form, and then there's the oval elongate form, and then there's the banana-shaped form, as well as these scatters of bivalve spat, which we're interpreting as having been regurgitated by a fish. Interestingly, plotting these spiral form coprolites, which occur at 3 different sites, we find a bimodal size distribution at all 3 sites. And this black line, stippled line here that represents the Coombs Hill locality, indicates to us that there were large vertebrates at the site, but we never ever found their bones. So I logged all these trace fossils into the strat column, and now the Witpoort formation starts to look quite alive. All the trace fossils occur within the estuarine facies assemblages, and none of them occur within the fluvial facies assemblages. Interesting. They're also very consistent with what we would expect from tidal deposits, with very low ichnodiversity, 1 to 3 ichnogenera per bedding plane. So the facies assemblages tend to occur in these repetitive cycles. I've found that these cycles are between 5 and 21 meters thick in the study area. They're always underlain by a sequence boundary that is mantled by conglomerates. And we get facies assemblage 1, which are the fluvial low stand deposits, trending upwards often to facies assemblage 2A, the fluvio estuarine ones, and then either with 2B, the heterolithic ones, or straight to 2C, the estuary muds. And these cycles are quite repetitive throughout the Roy-Rund member, whereas in the Paderput member, we're getting exclusively the fluvial components. So looking at some facies models, the shore face facies assemblage is quite typical. It's normally less than 20 meters thick in the rock record, and it goes from offshore muds with a progradation of storm and wave deposits up to your fair weather shore face, beach, and backshore. I found no evidence of this shore face facies assemblage in the Witpoort formation, contrary to what I thought when I first studied Coombs Hill. a barrier island system. As you can see, this is a retrogradational system where the facies are migrating landwards. And so you'll get a fining upward trend and then a coarsening upward trend as retrogradation happens. This type of model could explain some of what we see in the Witpoort Formation. And lastly, here we have the incised valley full model. Let's take another look. So in an incised valley, you'd expect firstly a sequence boundary, which is a surface of subaerial or fluvial erosion, followed by your low stand fluvial deposits as the shoreline progrades. And then as you get a relative sea level rise, you're starting to get the shoreline migrating landwards, and you'll get your Bayhead Delta deposits followed by your estuary basin muds. Then during your high stand, the shoreline will prograde again with your Bayhead Delta building out and your fluvial wedge developing over that. I think in the Witpoort Formation, there was not enough accommodation to include a full cycle of an estuarine incised valley full, and that we're getting mostly what we would see in this area of this facies model. Plotting my flow vectors, my paleocurrent indicators onto the map, we're getting some idea of what the shoreline might have looked like. The stippled line is my interpretation of what the maximum transgression would have been. And that's because we're getting a lot more heterolithics as well as tidal channels here in at Witpoort, whereas here in the east, it's mostly fluvial and inner estuary. So yeah, there we go. All right, so I've got probably quite a lot to say about event stratigraphy, but I think for this talk, I'm just going to make it quite light. I've reviewed the global stratigraphy of the Furmanian, and in these various sections, we're seeing that event stratigraphy can be mapped out. For one, it's very clear in these deep marine basins of the Rhenish Massif in Germany that by the time during these intervals where sandstone is making its way into the deep marine basin, that's when rapid sea level fall is occurring. And we can correlate across many of these basins where sea level falls are happening. The clearest of these is the Paardepoort member, which being exclusively fluvial represents your maximum regression in the Witpoort Formation. This is a late Furmanian event, which is contemporary with the Duncannon member in the Catskills in Pennsylvania, the Baggy Formation in the North Devon Basin, the Kitleri Formation in Latvia, the Evu Formation in Belgium, and the Dusberg sandstones in the Rhenish Massif. So here's a late Furmanian regression event that occurs worldwide, and it's pretty clearly expressed in the Paardepoort member. Now, if we map out the Witpoort Formation to a Furmanian floating astronomical time scale, which was developed by Paz et al. So Paz et al. Have used magnetic susceptibility as well as other geochemical parameters to suggest that differences in detrital influx are representing orbital cyclicity, which they interpret as a 405,000 year eccentricity cycle. That refers to the shape of Earth's orbit from circular to more eccentric. Interestingly, when I plotted my two composite sections next to this Paz et al. Timescale, I found that intervals of low eccentricity seem to correlate with episodes of maximum fluvial progradation in the Witpoort Formation. Paz et al. Have 31 eccentricity cycles, whereas we lose our cyclicity up here in the top, but I think we got between 20 and 25 of these cycles in the Roy Runt member. And I think we would expect that intervals of low eccentricity would correspond to sea level falls, as during low eccentricity, it's thought that glaciers are more likely to build up due to the modulation of seasonality during periods when the Earth's orbit is more circular. Yeah. All right. So lastly, if we compare the Upper Witpoort Formation with the Paderborn Memets-Skitterij-Kloof and the Kweekvlei Formation to Bolivia, we're seeing a very similar set of sequences. There in Bolivia, they have the Colpacucho Formation overlain by the Cumana Formation, which contains proven diamictites, and that is then sharply overlaid by the Casa Formation shale. It's just a very similar set of facies changes, and this seems to correspond with a late Devonian, or sorry, a terminal Furmanian, end Furmanian regressive event that was a global glaciation that brought the Devonian to an end. So my hypothesis that the Skitterij-Kloof extraformational conglomerates represents evidence for ice seems to fit with the stratigraphic evidence. Okay, so my two hypotheses, the first one, that the Witpoort Formation is open marine, I think we can exclude that. And the second one, that the Witpoort Formation accumulated during the Furmanian regression and that sea level was an important control on its facies distributions. Cool. So lastly, for those who want to go working in the Cape Fold Belt, and as you can see, there are a lot of mysteries there that still have to be solved. Just don't go in late summer, otherwise you'll find yourself hiding out under a thorn bush in 38-degree heat. Okay, well, this is my final slide. Sorry for a long presentation. So yeah, my next study is going to be taking a postdoc in Germany to work on the Moody's group with the BASE project. They drilled the Moody's and came out with a beautiful continuous core from the Archean. This is 3.2 billion years old rock, and I'm going to be looking at rhythmic sedimentation and climate change in South Africa, in Germany. So yeah, I'll be working with Professor David de Vlieshauer as well as his postdoc Nina Wichen, and they are both total experts on Devonian cyclostratigraphy. So to be continued. Yeah, if any of you students are interested in getting into Cape Supergroup sedimentology, I think we've got a couple more years of very nice, cushy genus funding to yeah, stimulate paleosciences in South Africa. So I think now is a very good time to go in and study in the Cape Fold Belt. Thank you.
Thanks, Cliff, for a very nice talk. Are there any questions?
So, yeah, those extra formational clasts, like what type of lithologies do you see?
Well, it's mostly quartz.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly quartz, probably from a what might be a granitic source or a very quartz-rich source. But yeah, I also found at one of the sites a class of what looked like black chert, and there's various other things. I mean, we've got jasper and various odds and ends. So definitely is worth having a concerted study on that Skitterij-Kloof nether.
I think there's an online question. I have to ask Sue to come through. Just make sure that she's...
Hi, yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey Sue, do you want to come through on the microphone? You should be audible.
I've unmuted, but can you hear me? Hello?
Maybe can I ask one more? Anytime.
I don't think they can hear me there, but the people online
I'm just
can.
curious, how does the, you know,
I'll
you
ask
said
it
that
in the
there's
chat.
proven diamictites in Bolivia and eastern US. How do those look on the paleogeographic reconstruction? Like, are they at similar paleolatitudes or lower or higher? Or
Yeah, so Bolivia should also be at roughly a similar latitude. There's different paleomagnetic projections. So I know Scatesi's map puts the South Pole in Brazil. But then again, there are diamictites in the Appalachian Basin, which was situated at about 30 degrees latitude at the time. So there they probably have more of a mountain glacier type. I think the fact is that in the Witpoort Formation, we just don't have maybe enough accommodation. We're not close enough to the source area to get immediate glacial outwash, but the stuff is reworked and those surface features are perhaps lost. Sue asks, we'll see. Yeah, so I think Sue is asking whether there has been anything published on tidal work in the Cape Fold Belt. Yeah, sure. I mean, well, to be continued for the Witpoort Formation. But yeah, I think Cameron has definitely identified some tidal features further down in the strap column. And yeah, previous workers have suggested tidal sedimentation, but have never really published evidence for that. Cameron, I'm not sure if you want to chip in here.
Yeah, okay, so I spoke, I'm not sure if Sue can hear, but
You have to go to, we'll bring a small microphone.
The small microphone.
all right.
which is screen.
Nearly 40. Sue, yeah, just to chime in here with Chris's question. So the only other places where there are unequivocal tidal deposits that have been documented other than what Chris has done on the Witpoort Formation is in the Kraftwater Formation, which is probably middle Ordovician. There's stuff in the Krakra Formation, which is late, was early middle Devonian, and of course Chris's stuff as well. So the problem that we have is that I think there could be more of these deposits, but they've been misinterpreted. So definitely in Chris's case over here, these things were shallow marine, and they clearly are not on there. But yeah, I think Chris, you want to answer the next question? Yeah, all right.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Sue asks, what's the length of the day or lunar month? Yeah, so there are actually some very good examples of tidal rhythmites in the Precambrian of Australia. And yeah, I think, well, it's a bit debated going further back in time, but in the Precambrian, I think we had a very similar orbital period as today. In fact, even in the Archean, the latest evidence suggests that the tidal cycle was very similar to what we have today. And that's explained because obviously the moon would have been closer then, but that's explained by the moon, the Earth having spun faster to compensate for the moon having been closer. So the idea is that everything has always been in balance. Yeah, so definitely in the Archean, the days would have been shorter.
Any other questions? CJ.
I'm not sure I believe is that in Geotalks,
Sure, thank you for the question. Okay, excuse me, what's your name again? Okay,
CJ.
I think CJ is asking, how do we explain the cyclical occurrences of conglomerate at the base of these cycles. Sure. So basically in a sea level cycle, you've got the sea level rise and you have the sea level fall. In the type of system that we're dealing with, which is an incised valley fault system, during your sea level fall, you're not getting any deposition, you only have erosion. So you've got a down cutting erosional surface, and then deposited on top of that, you have evidence of what has been cut away, and that forms your conglomerate. And then during the rising limb of your sea level cycle, you're getting shoreline backstepping. So all your cycles will have the most seaward shoreline to begin with, and will culminate in the most landward shoreline, at least in the case of the Witpoort Formation. So we're only really getting the rising part of a sea level cycle. And so, yes, the stratigraphic record of the Witpoort Formation is not complete.
I'll finish off with one question, which is, first, how close did you come to pinning down the location of the two big late Devonian extinction events anywhere in the Witwatersrand?
Okay. Oh, that's a great question. So, so yeah, the late Devonian extinction occurs before the main glaciation. Well, it's debated, but most of the evidence that I could gather suggested that the glaciation event is contemporary with what is known as the Hangenberg sandstone, which overlies the Hangenberg Black Shale, and that caused a global sea level fall. I would also contend that event stratigraphy is the best way to mark that extinction event globally. Whereas if you're using conodonts, well, conodonts can move, they can migrate, they can go locally extinct. So workers who use conodonts might have a lot of noise in their signal. So the Hangenberg event, I believe, occurs in the Skitteree Kloof member. With the Kalwasser event, which is the previous great extinction at the Franian-Furmenian boundary, I think the base of the Witpoort Formation could be diachronous. So I don't have any strong evidence to put a datum on that. I do believe, however, that the Kalwasser, which occurs at a sea level high stand at the end of the Franian, could be found somewhere in the upper Walterfriede Formation underlying the Witpoort Formation. And thank you for that very interesting question, because that's what we need to find.
Okay, thanks so much, Chris. Again, appreciate your talk. And